He was the voice behind one of the weirdest novelty songs in American history. But that was just the surface. Behind the cowboy hat and the goofy lyrics, Sheb Wooley hid a story most fans never heard. A story that touches Hollywood's secrets, hidden identities, and one very famous scream you've definitely heard even if you never knew it was him. But before the world saw him dancing with aliens on the Billboard charts, Sheb was leaving his mark in ways that were far more haunting and, in one case, downright legendary. Film editors still argue about it today. Was it really his voice in that scream used in Star Wars, Indiana Jones, and hundreds of other films? The infamous Wilhelm Scream? It might sound like a background sound effect, but its origins are tangled in mystery, and all signs point back to Sheb. And that's not even the wildest rumor about him. It's the scream you've heard 1,000 times, a high-pitched, drawn-out yell that's been dropped into everything from Star Wars and Indiana Jones to Toy Story and Kill Bill. Filmmakers use it as an inside joke, a nod to movie history, but almost no one knows where it came from or who recorded it. The answer? A lanky, guitar-strumming cowboy from Oklahoma, Sheb Wooley. Though never officially credited, insiders in the industry, especially those tied to the Warner Brothers, sound department have whispered for years that it was Sheb who recorded the now infamous scream during a Foley session in the early 50s. He was known for goofing around on set, doing odd voices, sound effects, and making crew members laugh between takes. So when a scene in a film needed a soldier screaming after being shot by an arrow, Sheb supposedly stepped into the booth and let it rip. The sound was labeled simply "man being eaten by alligator," later reused in a film called The Charge at Feather River, and from there, it somehow took on a life of its own. It was archived, reused, remixed, and passed down like an industry heirloom. But the voice? That raw, slightly ridiculous, unmistakable scream? It all traces back to Sheb, the same guy who sang about a one-eyed, one-horned alien monster. In one strange twist of fate, Sheb Wooley became immortal in Hollywood, not for a role or a hit song, but for a scream. But that wasn't the only place he left his mark. Before the cameras, before the costumes, and long before the scream, Sheb Wooley was just a boy growing up on the unforgiving plains of Oklahoma. Born in 1921 during the depths of the Great Depression, his childhood wasn't easy, but it shaped him in all the right ways. He learned to ride before he could drive, worked cattle, and played music with a raw, homemade charm. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. He didn't just hear country music, he lived it. The grit, the rhythm, the stories of hard men with harder lives, it was all right outside his door. He taught himself to play the violin, picked up songwriting like it was second nature, and by the time he was a teenager, he already knew two things. He wanted to perform, and he wasn't built for an ordinary life. But Sheb wasn't just a dreamer, he was a doer. He rode in rodeos. He played semi-pro baseball, and when World War II broke out, he joined the army, ready to serve. A foot injury kept him from being deployed, but it didn't stop him from moving forward. After the war, with nothing but grit and a guitar, Sheb headed to Fort Worth, then Hollywood. He didn't have connections, just a face built for westerns and a personality you couldn't ignore. And when the roles started rolling in, they didn't come quietly. He didn't look like a polished leading man, and that was exactly the point. He was authentic, real. The kind of guy who could pull off a villain, a lawman, or a wisecracking sidekick without breaking a sweat. His breakout came in High Noon, playing the menacing Ben Miller opposite Gary Cooper. Suddenly, this kid from a dusty Oklahoma town was in the big leagues, and he fit right in. But Hollywood was just getting to know him. The next chapter would prove Sheb wasn't just here to act, he was here to evolve. Behind the camera, Sheb Wooley's life was just as dramatic and unpredictable as anything he played on screen. Over the course of his life, he was married 5 times. And each relationship wasn't just a love story, it was a marker of where he was in his journey. His first marriage came early, in 1940, when he was still finding his way through music and wartime uncertainty. Her name was Melva Miller, cousin of country music legend Roger Miller. It didn't last, but it gave Sheb his first sense of domestic life, something steady while the world around him shifted. It was short-lived, but foundational. By 1946, Sheb had remarried this time to Edna Talbot Bunt in Fort Worth, Texas. It was a transitional phase, not quite famous yet, not quite settled either. He was balancing ambition with the daily grind, navigating both the music scene and early film roles. Not much is known about Edna or their time together, but the relationship quietly faded as his career gained momentum. Then came Beverly Irene Addington and everything changed. This was the one that lasted, nearly 2 decades of partnership, laughter, and real life. Together, they adopted a daughter, Christy Lynn, and built the kind of home Sheb never really had growing up. He adored fatherhood, and for once, things felt grounded. Even as his fame rose, this chapter gave him something deeper: stability. But even this long-standing bond came to an end. In 1985, Sheb married Deanna Gruglin. By now, his career had stretched across decades. He was still performing, still recording, but age was creeping in, and the industry was changing fast. Their marriage didn't last long, and not much of it was public. But it marked another shift, a softer, more private Sheb, wrestling with time and change. His 5th and final marriage was to someone who had already been by his side professionally for years, Linda Dodson, his longtime manager. This wasn't just romance, it was partnership in every sense. Linda knew every part of his life: the stage, the contracts, the late-night writing sessions. They married late in life, and with her daughter Shauna, they formed a blended family that brought Sheb a kind of peace he'd been chasing for decades. 5 marriages, 5 phases, some brief, some lasting, but each one left a mark. Through it all, Sheb was searching for love, for belonging, and maybe for the kind of storybook ending he so often gave his characters. But even with all that, his most unexpected success and weirdest transformation was still to come. In 1958, Sheb Wooley did something nobody expected. He released a song so strange, so catchy, and so utterly bizarre that it skyrocketed to #1 on the Billboard charts and etched his name into pop culture history forever. The Purple People Eater. A one-eyed, one-horned creature from outer space who came to Earth to play rock and roll? It sounded like something cooked up in a fever dream, but that's exactly why it worked. Kids loved it. Adults couldn't stop humming it. Radio stations wore it out. The song became a national obsession. And Sheb, the rugged cowboy villain from westerns, suddenly found himself playing the role of novelty music king. But here's the twist. Sheb didn't write it as a joke. He wrote it because he got humor. He understood timing, absurdity, and how to walk the line between goofy and brilliant. And it wasn't a one-time gimmick. After the explosion of Purple People Eater, Sheb leaned into the weirdness. That's when Ben Colder was born, a boozy, bumbling alter ego who sang parody versions of country hits with slurred words and absurd lyrics. Under that name, Sheb took aim at everything from Hank Snow to Johnny Cash, twisting their serious ballads into comedic gold. Ben Colder became a cult figure, the kind of character who'd show up drunk to his own recording session and still leave with a hit. And here's what made it work. Sheb never punched down. His satire had charm, not malice. It was self-aware and goofy, not bitter or mean, spirited. He wasn't mocking country music, he was celebrating it by playing with its edges. Most people don't realize it, but Wooley released dozens of songs under both names: straight country, novelty, parody, and everything in between. He built a niche that nobody else was occupying, carving out space in the music world that was uniquely his. Even as trends changed and the industry evolved, Sheb kept making music. Not for charts, not for fame, but because he loved it. Because it was how he processed the world, through stories, through laughter, through melody. But the music wasn't the only thing keeping people talking. What he wrote in his memoir would turn heads decades later. In the final chapters of his life, Sheb Wooley sat down to write a memoir. And tucked inside, far from the charts and cowboy sets, was a confession that stopped readers cold. 3 words: bold, blunt, unapologetic. He was massive. He was talking about Eric Fleming, the stoic, chiseled star of Rawhide. And while most assumed Sheb was referring to Fleming's towering height and screen presence, the rest of the chapter raised far more questions than it answered. According to Wooley, Working with Fleming was like being in the orbit of a planet. He described an intensity, a silence that filled the room before Fleming even spoke. "You felt him," Sheb wrote, "before you saw him." The respect was instant, not demanded, but automatic. He didn't carry himself like a celebrity. He carried himself like a man who'd survived something. And Fleming had. Sheb recounted their deep, off-camera conversations, often between takes, when the dust had settled and the cameras stopped rolling. Fleming spoke of reform school, violence, and survival. His childhood wasn't just rough, it was traumatic. But somehow, he emerged philosophical, even spiritual. He'd quote Tolstoy and Kierkegaard in the middle of dusty, gunslinging westerns. Sheb said, "He was the only man I ever met who could talk about God and gunfights in the same breath and make you believe both." But the chapter didn't just reveal Fleming's depth. It hinted at something else, something no one was quite ready to say out loud. Wooley's language was playful but charged. He wrote that wardrobe departments had to get creative with Eric's jeans and that the women on set weren't complaining. It was a wink, a nudge, and a bombshell wrapped in cowboy charm. He never confirmed anything directly, but readers and fellow actors have speculated ever since. Was it about attraction? Jealousy? Admiration? Or something deeper, something unspoken that passed between two men who shared the spotlight, the silence, and maybe even the struggle? One thing's certain, Sheb didn't share those words lightly. When Eric Fleming tragically died in 1966 during a freak on-set accident in the Peruvian jungle, Wooley said he wept openly. Not just for a co-star, not just for a friend, but for someone who had left a permanent, complicated mark on him. He was massive in every sense of the word, Sheb wrote, and he never elaborated further. He didn't have to. By the mid-1990s, Sheb Wooley had done it all: films, hit songs, television fame, comedy records, and even a scream that would echo through cinematic history. But then came the one fight he couldn't spin into a punchline. In 1996, doctors gave him a diagnosis that changed everything: leukemia. For a man who had spent a lifetime filling rooms with laughter, song, and cowboy grit, the news hit hard. Sheb had always seemed larger than life, too stubborn, too funny, too full of energy to fade quietly. But cancer didn't care about charisma. Still, he fought it the only way he knew how, with grace, grit, and a little humor. Friends who visited during those final years said he still cracked jokes, still picked up the guitar when he had the strength, still wanted to entertain, even as the disease wore him down. But by 1999, he could no longer ignore what his body was telling him. He stepped away from the spotlight not with a dramatic farewell tour or a final performance, but with quiet dignity. For someone who had spent decades performing, retreating from the stage wasn't just a career decision, it was a surrender. A necessary, painful goodbye to the part of his life that had defined him. Yet even in those last few years, Sheb remained surrounded by love. His fifth wife, Linda Dodson, stayed by his side. His adopted daughter, Christy Lynn, and stepdaughter, Shauna, remained close. And the fans? They never really left. Letters still came. Tributes poured in. People remembered the cowboy who made them laugh, who gave them stories, and who, without most realizing, had literally screamed his way into film history. On the 16th of September, 2003, Sheb Wooley passed away at the age of 82 in Nashville, Tennessee. No final curtain call, no spotlight, just peace. But while the man was gone, the legacy was still playing. And in the most unexpected way, it never really stopped. You might not see his name in lights anymore. His face isn't splashed across streaming platforms or trending on social media. But listen closely, and Sheb Wooley is still there. Every time that infamous Wilhelm Scream cuts through an action scene, it's his voice buried in the background but impossible to ignore. Every time a novelty song pushes its way into pop culture, it echoes something he did first, and did better, with a monster from space and a wink in his voice. And every time someone spoofs country music with a twang and a smirk, they're following the path Sheb carved out with Ben Colder decades before parody became its own genre. He was a man of contradictions, a rugged cowboy with a violin, a tough guy who wrote jokes, a novelty singer who quietly changed the soundscape of an entire industry. And through all the chaos, the marriages, the roles, the reinventions, one thing never changed. Sheb Wooley made people feel something. He made them laugh, made them curious, made them think twice about what a country artist could be. And maybe that's why he stuck not just as a star, but as a presence. Quiet, lasting, weirdly unforgettable. Today, he rests in Hendersonville, Tennessee, surrounded by other legends of country music. But his legacy? It's not 6 feet deep. It's still playing, still screaming, still smiling behind the lyrics. Because Sheb Wooley didn't just leave behind songs and shows, he left behind echoes. In the end, Sheb Wooley didn't just play characters, he became one. A walking contradiction with a cowboy hat, a violin, a punchline, and a scream that outlived him. He was the kind of man Hollywood doesn't make anymore. Because they couldn't if they tried. Maybe that's why he still shows up not in front of the camera, but behind the scenes, in the sound of a scream, in the twist of a parody, in the strange, unforgettable corners of pop culture that nobody else dared to claim. He lived loud, he died quietly, but his story? It still whispers to anyone curious enough to listen. And if you've made it this far, maybe you're one of those people.